My name is Tim Mooney. I'm Senior Counsel at Alliance for Justice. And Alliance for Justice, if you're not aware of us, we are made up of two different projects. You may have heard of our work on judicial advocacy. The other side of the office, my side of the office, Boulder Advocacy, we go around the country. Well, at least we used to go around the country. Now we do it like this and teach the laws of advocacy for 501c3 organizations quite like yourselves. So I'm very excited to be here. I have a background in environmental litigation and then moved on into this area of law over the years. I've been doing this for about 2 decades now. So it is an interesting area of law, but I will say congratulations, you just signed up for a 2-hour tax law seminar. I'll try to make this at least a little bit interesting as we go along and make it relevant to the type of work that you're doing. We'll have some real world examples, including some of your own, just to highlight how this all goes. Of course, if you've got questions, I'm really excited to answer them. This format makes it a little bit difficult to do it kind of as we go along, but we'll have you put the questions into the Q&A and we will answer them. We've got 2 big blocks at the end of each session. We're going to start off talking about lobbying activity, and then we're going to do the end of the day, as was mentioned before, on election-related activity, what you can do out of New America. So let's get started with all of this, and I'm going to start off by giving a bit of an overview on different types of nonprofit organizations out there. You probably know this, and this is a bit of a review for many of you, I would think, that you are not the only type of nonprofit out there. New America, my organization, Alliance for Justice, and Detention Watch Network, that's an example organization that I'm going to be using. I just actually did a recent seminar for them, and they had some really great examples to help supplement some of the real world examples I'm going to use from your organization. All of our organizations are 501c3 public charities. And I say a public charity because there's actually 2 types of 501c3 organizations. There's also private foundations. So we like to get to know them pretty well because they tend to fund us. But as public charities, our tax treatment, it's as good as the government gives us. It is the best tax treatment for nonprofits altogether. Tax exempt. We don't tend to pay taxes at any level of government, federal, state, local, whatever. Tax exempt, don't pay taxes. But the big magical piece to all of this, and kind of the crux to everything that I'm going to be talking about today, is the fact that you're able to offer tax deductibility out of a C3 public charity to your donors. So they get to write it off on their taxes. That is something that's unique amongst the different nonprofit types. And one thing that I've noticed in practicing in this area for the last couple of decades is the better your tax treatment, the more restrictions you're going to find on your advocacy work. And advocacy, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, encompasses a whole ton of things. I'm going to focus for purposes of this discussion on the 2 areas that we're going to be talking about today. Lobbying activity. 501c3 public charities can do it. They're just limited in how much they can do it. We'll talk a little bit about the limits, the definitions, and things about that here in the first half of our discussion. The second half of our discussion, after we have a break today, will be on electoral activities. And this one is a lot stricter. You're not allowed to do anything to support or oppose a candidate for public office. You've got to be strictly nonpartisan out of a 501c3 public charity. And this rule, it's a little bit more subjective, and we're going to spend a lot more time with that one because although it seems like a simple rule, the application of it can get a little bit complicated. So we're going to spend a lot of time on that today in the second half of our time together. I want to compare and contrast our organizations, C3s, with other types of organizations out there. Now, I talked about the other side of the office before. Well, kind of on the other side of the office as well is Alliance for Justice Action Campaign. This is our affiliated 501c4 organization. C4s, C5s, C6s. By the way, if you never knew where these numbers came from, I'm here to tell you that tax lawyers, we are inherently uncreative little beasts. we can't come up with good names apparently because we just name these nonprofits after sections of the tax code under which they're written. So section 501c4, Section 501c4 is for 501c4 organizations, social welfare organizations. We'll talk about a little bit more about those in a second. I also want to mention C5s and C6s here. Why? C5s are labor unions. C6s are trade associations. I lump them all together because the rules for purposes of what we're going to be talking about today are all pretty much the same. So sister organization, Alliance for Justice Action Campaign, League of Conservation Voters, ACLU, a whole bunch of different types of social welfare organizations. They're better built for advocacy, and we'll find out why in a second. Again, same rules for a labor union like SEIU, and trade associations. The most famous trade association that nobody realizes is a nonprofit, the National Football League. So weird that's a nonprofit, and yet it is. So trade associations, all under the same rules. Tax treatment for these organizations, they're tax exempt like C3s, but what they can't offer to their contributors is tax deductibility for those contributions. That's a really big deal. It makes it harder to raise money for these types of organizations. And so the tax treatment on balance compared to C3s, not nearly as good. So remember what I said before, when your tax treatment is the best that's out there, you have more restrictions on your advocacy. For these organizations, tax treatment is a little bit less favorable, more ability to engage in advocacy work. And that's what C4s, C5s, and C6s are kind of best built for. Lobbying, they can do as much of it as they want, unlimited amounts. And that's what most of these organizations will tend to be working on, legislative lobbying activities. Electoral activities, unlike C3s, they are allowed to do things to support or oppose candidates. But tax law has one big caveat to all of that, and it says you can't make it your primary activity. It has to be your secondary activity. It has to be less than half of what you do, roughly. That's sort of the thumbnail sketch on that. As we'll learn with the IRS, they don't like to define things very well. And the definition of primary activity is, well, you can spend a lot of time flipping through the regulations and the tax code, and you will not find a definition of it. And we have to sort of do a best guess on things. That is a theme that you will hear again and again and again. We don't get a lot of guidance from the IRS on what the law says. Last but not least, 527 organizations. I'm only going to mention them in passing, only to note that they are sort of the mirror opposite of a 501c3. These are candidate committees, political committees, PACs, political parties, things along those lines. Emily's List, LCV Victory Fund, the Democratic Party, your favorite candidate's campaign. Tax exempt organizations, they're organized under Section 527 of the Internal Revenue Code. And like I said, mirror opposite of C3s. They don't engage in any lobbying activity. Why? Because they get taxed if they do. Their exempt purpose, what they're solely supposed to be doing things to support or oppose candidates for public office. Like I said, mirror opposite of C3s, you're not going to engage in a lot of activity with 527s. You may be in coalitions, you may be allied with lots of different organizations in C4, C5, and C6 land. And so I put that all out there just so that you understand when I talk about the rules that we're going to be covering today, and you're sitting there scratching your head going, wait a second, I know this other nonprofit over there, and they do as much lobbying as they want, or they do things that support or oppose candidates. Why is it that we can't do it? Well, it's probably because those are a C4, C5, or another type of 501c organization. So this gives you the lay of the land on nonprofit organizations. We're going to spend the bulk of the first part of the hour, at least until about the top of the hour, covering this box right here, the limitations on lobbying for 501c3 organizations. Now, I'm going to say one thing about this. There are limits on what you can do. In other words, you can't do an unlimited amount, but the limitations are actually pretty generous. And I think you'll see why in a moment. Also, the limitations only apply to lobbying activity as it's defined under the law. And as you'll note in a few minutes as we cover these things, as we cover the definitions and the exceptions, there's a whole host of advocacy work that just doesn't get covered by this, and you can do as much as you want of that. So let's get cracking on this. I said at the top of the show here that I'm going to talk about advocacy very broadly. This slide is a non-exhaustive list of all of the different types of advocacy out there. The word advocacy is not really defined in the law per se. What is partisan political activity and lobbying. All other types of advocacy work, or community organizing, educating, changing corporate behavior, nonpartisan voter education, research, skills training, any of those things that don't fall in the definitions of those two things, well, you can do as much of it as you want as a 501c3. There's nothing under the law that limits it, so long as it's part of your exempt purpose. So that's why you see a lot of organizations that are organized under C3, the public charities, do a lot of education. They do a lot of research. They do all sorts of things in those areas. And, it doesn't really matter what you call it. I consider it advocacy work. The IRS says you can do as much of it as you want. The only things that are limited to you as a C3, lobbying activity, we already said, you're limited in how much you can do. Partisan political activity, complete ban on that. You can't even touch that at all. Let's get a little bit into what the limits look like. So there are two different ways to measure lobbying under the law. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. I just want to make sure that you're aware of it. If you're a C3 and you just form your brand new 501c3, congratulations, you are working under what's called the insubstantial part test when it comes to lobbying activity. Some people think that this is a terrible, terrible way to measure lobbying, me included, I'll be honest. Why? The definition of lobbying, there is none. And what insubstantial means, not defined at all. So the law says, hey, great, you're a C3, you can engage in lobbying, but only if it's an insubstantial part of your overall activities. But we're not going to tell you what those activities are, and we're not going to tell you how much insubstantial is. Not great, not great at all. In the 1970s, there was a change in the law that, for reasons that are unclear to me, why it didn't just replace the insubstantial part test. Section 501H of the Internal Revenue Code. I'll try not to get into too much legal jargon here or code sections, but we call this the 501H expenditure test. And what that does is it gives clear definitions of lobbying, a hard cap on how much money you can spend on lobbying. And third, and most importantly, it's only expenditures that count. So volunteer activity doesn't count at all. So if you're engaged in any kind of volunteer activity and working under this test, or anything that's cost-free, well, it just doesn't count against your cap, even if it falls under the definitions of lobbying. I know that your organization has done the 501H expenditure election. We call it the 501H election. And it's a calculation like you see right here. And I happen to know that you're over $17 million in your overall annual expenditures. So there is a hard cap at that point. Once you become a big enough organization, there's a hard cap of an overall lobbying limit of $1 million. I know, $1 million of your capacity, of your budget, can be spent on lobbying. Most organizations of your size don't come anywhere near that at all. In fact, even the smaller organizations, if you take a look at this calculation chart, don't come anywhere near their overall limit. For most organizations, it'll be, they're usually in the $500,000 or less range. That's why you sometimes will hear you can lobby up to 20% of your overall activity. Occasionally you'll hear that floated about. The reality is it depends on the nature and size of your organization. So congratulations, you can lobby up to $1 million of your budget because of your budget size. 1/4 of that can be used for one of the things that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes here, grassroots lobbying, because lobbying comes in two flavors. There's direct lobbying, which is going to legislators directly and saying, hey, here's how we feel about this piece of legislation, vote for it, vote against it. And grassroots lobbying, which is going to the general public and saying, hey, everybody, this is how we feel about this piece of legislation. Now, why don't you go and contact your legislators and tell them about it? For reasons that are, again, not super clear in the legislative history, you're only allowed to do 1/4 of your overall lobbying limit on grassroots lobbying. The rest can be direct lobbying. And any combination of that. If you don't engage in any grassroots lobbying at all, you can lobby up to $1 million in your case in direct lobbying. But you're only allowed to go up to $250,000 of that in grassroots lobbying. Important to note on that, just so that you don't think, oh, well, we'll just do all grassroots lobbying. It can't do that, unfortunately, under the rules. Let's get into what the definitions of lobbying are. This is critically important. Why? It's not just that you know what lobbying is, and that's really important. Obviously, you're limited in how much you can do. You need to know how much it is. But when you've got a clear, bright line definition like you've got here, you know what lobbying is not, because if it doesn't fall within these definitions of either direct or grassroots lobbying, I don't care what you call it. It could be education, it could be research, it could be just advocacy with a capital A. You could do as much of it as you want. You're not limited at all. So let's go through this and go through it. I like to look at this as, if you've watched any cop shows or any of those legal shows that are out there that are so fun to watch these days, they'll often hear things about the elements of the crime. Well, this is the elements of lobbying. So you need every single one of these elements under either definition for it to count as either direct or grassroots lobbying. You miss one piece, one element, it doesn't count as lobbying. You can do as much of it as you want. So let's get going on this. Both definitions, direct and grassroots lobbying, have one thing in common, and that is a communication. And a communication is any way of getting your point of view across. It could be a letter, it could be a text, it could be a DM, it could be a meeting, it could be a webinar, it could be a projection on the side of a hotel, for instance. Any way of getting your point of view across is a communication. So this one, pretty easy to understand, pretty easy to be a part of any definition. If you're not communicating well, you probably, common sense dictates you're not lobbying. So let's move on to the next thing. For direct lobbying, it is talking to legislators. Now, legislators, this is an interesting area. Legislators, it's probably everybody that you're thinking of and then a few more on top of that. And I'll explain why in a second. Let's start off with the easy stuff. Who counts as a legislator? That's probably pretty clear. Federal, state, and local officials who are part of legislative bodies, Congress, State House, County Board of Supervisors, City Council, things along those lines, regional government, and if you're in Portland, Oregon, and that area, Multnomah County in Oregon, they all count, and their staff. So if you're talking to a chief of staff, if you're talking to a legislative assistant, legislative counsel, someone along those lines, all of those folks count as legislators for purposes of the rule. One other area which is a little bit interesting, ballot measures. So remember I said, hey, you're not allowed to do anything to support or oppose candidates for public office. Well, it turns out if you're doing something that supports or opposes ballot measures, even though it's in an election, even though you're talking to voters, it's allowed in this context. Why is that? The rules are basically written like this. The general public is considered a gigantic legislative body, and they are considering this piece of legislation that's before this gigantic public legislative body. So when you talk to them, even though it sort of feels like it's grassroots lobbying because you're talking to the general public, in this one instance, this is an exception, the law treats it as if you are talking to lots and lots of legislators in a big legislative body. It counts as direct lobbying in this instance. So for ballot measure advocacy, the general public counts. So context matters sometimes. Let me give you another example of when context matters, whether someone's a legislator or not. I may be betraying my age a little bit, although my gray hair usually gives that away. I'm a proud member of Generation X. And one way that we learned all about government when we were children is we were watching TV and cartoons. And there was a cartoon called Schoolhouse Rock. And it said, in one really great one, it said that government is essentially a three-ring circus. There's your legislative branch, your executive branch, and your judicial branch. Well, it turns out Schoolhouse Rock was a little bit wrong here, and it just blows me away to say that. But executive branch officials are sometimes members of the legislative branch for purposes of these rules. When is that? It's context driven. Presidents, governors, mayors, or any executive official that is participating in the formulation of legislation, they are considered legislators for purposes of the lobbying definition here. So where are we going to have that? Well, one thing is if they're submitting a budget, which chief executives tend to do all the time. So maybe not so much on mayors. Sometimes mayors will have that. But governors almost always, president definitely. Submitting a budget to Congress or to the State House, that's going to be considered legislative in nature. So if you're communicating with an executive branch official, chief executive in that instance, about the budget, you're talking to a legislator in that instance. So you are definitely in direct lobbying territory at that point. Another area where a president, a governor, and sometimes mayors are participating in the formulation of legislation where it's really, really important when they're considering signing or vetoing legislation to the extent that they've got that power. If you're having a conversation about signing or vetoing legislation with a chief executive, you're talking to a legislator in that instance. So context matters in terms of this definition. I want to talk a little bit about who is not a legislator. And one thing I'll say at the top here is if someone is not a legislator, then you are not in lobbying territory. You can do as much of it as you want. You're not engaged in lobbying activity if you are talking to school boards, zoning boards, housing authorities, sewer and water districts. I'm guessing you may not be doing a ton of that, but maybe you are at some point. What are these organizations? They are special purpose bodies. What does that mean? They may be elected. They may actually have quite a bit of power. I'm looking at you, zoning boards. Zoning boards can have a ton of really important authority. Sometimes some of these entities like school boards have a ton of authority and they're elected officials. But because they don't have what we call plenary authority under the law, they aren't considered legislators. Plenary authority is basically, to boil it down, it says, I'm on a school board. I can't vote on things that have to do with housing or zoning or water or criminal enforcement or anything like that. I'm penned in. I can only pass laws or ordinances, or my authority only extends to schools and the school district. So if you don't have plenary authority, you're on a special purpose body, and talking to somebody in that instance is never going to be lobbying because they aren't considered legislators for purposes of the rule. So let's take a look at some examples here. Here's a great example of a special purpose board. The state of or Commonwealth of Massachusetts created a COVID-19 board, strategic decision making related to pandemic response. Really, really important. Probably some critical areas of policy are being made on this board, and it's probably going to executive branch officials and potentially to legislative branch officials. These are very powerful folks, but guess what? These are not considered legislators because they are on a special board. Talking before them, you can do it as you want. It's not considered lobbying activity because they're on a special purpose board. What else? Let's talk about specific legislation, because this gets into some other areas as well. And for those of you who are thinking, what about regulatory bodies? I'm going to be getting to that in a moment here. In fact, I'm going to be getting into it very quickly. Expressing a view about specific legislation. This is going to be another example where I talk about legislation. Well, let me start with expressing a view. It's hard when you're communicating with legislators or to the general public to avoid expressing a view. I suppose we can come up with a few examples, but for the most part, when we're doing this analysis, expressing a view is kind of a given. What's not a given is whether you're expressing a view about specific legislation. Specific legislation, kind of like the last subject we talked about, legislators, a lot of things that you're thinking of for sure, and then a few more as well. So specific legislation, anything that has been submitted, it's got a title, it's got a bill number. The budget always is specific legislation, whether it's federal, state, local, whatever. Budgets, specific legislation. Confirmation hearings. This is a weird one, right? This isn't really a law so much as it is an action by a legislative body. And in fact, it's a unicameral action in most instances. It's only advice and consent of the Senate at the federal level, for instance, usually at the state level as well. Well, it turns out the IRS and tax law says this counts. This is legislation, even though it's not getting, it's on a piece of paper that's being signed by the president or the governor. This is enough of a legislative act by a legislative body, that this counts. So confirmation hearings of, in this instance, now former DHS Director Kirstjen Nielsen, or any other cabinet level official that goes through an advice and consent process. I had mentioned that the other side of my office works a lot on judicial nominations. Judges, we spend a ton of time on that side of the office going through advice and consent process on the Senate. It's all direct lobbying because it has to do with the confirmation hearings and taking a stance on judges that are put up before the Senate Judiciary Committee. So that counts as lobbying. It counts as lobbying because it's specific legislation. I want to talk about something else that is specific legislation. So we covered active legislation, kind of file under duh, that's obvious. Draft legislation. So if something hasn't been submitted yet it is actual legislative language, maybe it's in some kind of a draft form, maybe they're batting around ideas, maybe you're helping to draft legislation. That counts. Draft legislation counts. But one other thing counts, and this is where a lot of folks go, oh, wait, I didn't know this counted. And that is something that we call, or I shouldn't say we call, the law calls a specific policy proposal. What the heck is that? Well, it says that something is specific legislation, even if something hasn't been introduced, it hasn't even been written. In other words, you could come up with specific legislation in a conversation with a legislative council or a chief of staff or a member of Congress. Even if it's a not fully fleshed out thing, it could still be specific legislation. So what is a specific policy proposal? If you really want to boil it down, it's any way of expressing a solution to a problem that can only be solved through the passage of legislation in the context of your communication. So in other words, if you're saying, well, you know what, we're batting around on ideas on how to improve broadband access for rural communities, and what if we created a pool of money that was $1 billion for rural broadband? You just made it up on the spot, right? That's a specific policy proposal that would require legislation to be passed in order for it to go through. Congratulations, that is specific legislation. Why? Solving a problem through a legislative solution that could only be through a legislative solution right there on the spot. So you may be lobbying in a conversation and not even realize it. Just because a bill doesn't exist in that moment doesn't mean that you can't be engaged in lobbying activity. Now, one thing I will say, this is usually if I'm in an actual room with people where the oxygen level drops about 20%, the barometric pressure drops because everybody kind of sucks in. They don't, and everybody's a little freaked out that this means that there's a lot of activity that you thought wasn't lobbying that actually is. Hold on to that thought for a moment, because I'm about to get into a whole host of things that maybe you thought was lobbying activity that actually isn't, because either it doesn't meet the definition of legislation, or it is something that falls within a very specific exception, where things that actually count as lobbying if you've just followed the definitions like we have right now, but Congress, the IRS says, no, these are too important for nonprofits to be limited in doing. We want public charities to be able to do as much of these as we want. We're going to carve out some exceptions. So hold on to that thought for a moment here. We'll get to all of those in a bit. Let's go to things that don't count as lobbying activity: regulations, executive orders, enforcement of existing laws, and litigation. None of these things have to do with legislation, because the laws in every single one of these instances have already been passed, or these are actions of either the executive branch or of potentially the judicial branch getting involved in the litigation side of things. Nothing in this area counts as lobbying. You can do as much as you want of any of these things. Example, very recently, OTI, hi, hi everyone. OTI and Coalition opposed DC Department of Transportation's new rules requiring scooter and e-bike companies to share location information. This was something that was a regulatory matter before the District of Columbia, and OTI stepped up and said, no, we oppose this. We oppose this new rule. That is something that you can do. It's good advocacy work, and you can do as much of it as you want. Advocacy on any regulatory matter is not considered lobbying. And I use this example because regulatory matters happen at the local level, the state level, and the federal level. I thought this was a really interesting example. So I'm going to steal this to use in future presentations. Executive orders. Here's an executive order that I believe, this came out very recently, May 15th. Executive order on securing the information and communications technology and services supply chain, coming through the president's office. Advocating on this, not sure if you took a stance on this, but advocating on this type of thing, it's an executive order. It's an action solely from the President of the United States in this instance, giving essentially marching orders to everyone that works within the executive branch as to how laws are either enforced or interpreted or anything along those lines. The law, critically here, has already been passed. There's no new legislation, but this can be really, really important advocacy work, because this could be very important policy changes, alterations, ways of making things clearer through executive orders. Good news is, C3 organizations, you can advocate as much as you want on these things, because it's not considered lobbying activity. Let's talk about the last piece here. If you look all the way at the bottom here, you'll notice in grassroots lobbying, it's got an extra element compared to direct lobbying. It's a communication to the general public expressing your view about specific legislation, which I think we've all covered here. It also has something called a call to action. Remember when I kind of rattled out the basic definition of this, saying, hey, everybody, here's how we feel about this piece of legislation. Now go contact your legislators. That last piece, that's the call to action. Call to action is asking the general public, hey, we've told you what we think. Now go contact your legislator. It comes in a very specific definition. It's got to be one of these four things, otherwise it doesn't count as a call to action. Remember, if you're missing an element, then you're not lobbying. So call to action is a very important element to grassroots lobbying. The first thing that could be a call to action is exactly what I just said, just literally explicitly saying, hey, everybody, go contact your senator, your member of the House of Representatives, your state house, your city council member, asking, just explicitly asking. It also is providing some kind of address, telephone, or other contact information of legislators. You'll often see the Capitol Hill switchboard number that is put out on a lot of communication. That counts as a call to action. Just doing that alone is a call to action. Also providing a mechanism to enable communication with legislators. Click here to send a message. Used to be postcards, fill out this postcard and we'll deliver it to your member of Congress. Any kind of a mechanism is a way that would be counted as a call to action. And last but not least, and this is one that is called an indirect call to action, and kind of dog ear this for a moment here, because The other ones are called direct calls to action. This one's called an indirect call to action, which is going to be important in one of our later exceptions, because you're not allowed to do a direct call to action, those first three, but in that exception, you are allowed to do this last one, an indirect call to action. And that is simply identifying legislators. If you're in outside of that exception that we'll talk about in a little bit, just simply saying Senator so-and-so, who might be voting on that type of thing, just mentioning that senator's name, that would be enough, because you're identifying the legislator within that context of that communication. So that can go, that's not a terribly effective call to action. One thing that I like to say at this point for folks that are engaged in lobbying activity is, if you're going to engage in lobbying activity, engage in grassroots lobbying activity. Be explicit. By the way, it doesn't matter how many calls to action you have in your communication. It doesn't like double or triple if you have 2 or 3 calls to action. Do whatever it is that makes sense to communicate that you want folks to follow through and go contact their legislators. Don't just throw their name in there. That's just not a very effective way of doing it. But as you'll notice, it can be enough to tip something into grassroots lobbying. So we'll get to some examples here in a moment. Let's use this example right here. This is from an organization I just did a training with recently called the Detention Watch Network. And you'll notice here, the tweet from April 23rd, follow this sample script when filming your message. Oh, I got a window in the way, so I can't, there we go. Hashtag defund hate for a sample email copy visit, and there's a link. What are calls to action in all of this? Well, one thing is sample script. It's a mechanism. It's a way of trying to get across your point of view. It's a way of communicating that way for the intended audience. Also, email for the sample email copy, visit this link. And in that postcard, you'll notice here, it says, hello, representative / senator name. My name is me, and I live in the city. And basically, it goes through this entire ask for defunding hate and investing in communities. And of course, that has to do with a particular piece of legislation that is before that. This counts as a call to action. So this communication is grassroots lobbying. One thing I want to mention here, remember way back at the beginning, I said that this is an expenditure-based test, right? So you fulfill all of the elements of grassroots lobbying here. How much does it count against your overall cap? Well, the answer is, how much money did this cost you? It's staff time, it's prep time, it's any meetings that went into this, and it's the actual communication itself. Now, back in the day, we didn't have social media, and we used to have to go through really expensive ways of putting out our message. Now with social media, a tweet, how much does the tweet cost? I mean, a fraction of an hour. What we do is we use our timesheets to figure that out, and then somebody in the office has the unenviable task of taking all of the timesheets and say, okay, I engaged in 1 hour of grassroots lobbying this month. They apply that to your compensation, and then that becomes a dollar figure that goes into the bucket, and they aggregate that all together, add it all up. And at the end of the year, that gets filled out in the Form 990 for the organization, the tax return. Used to be, actually, what is today? It would have been normally on the 15th of May, all of the 990s are due, but because of gestures broadly, all of this, it's going to be July 15th. So we all got a little bit of a break for filling out our 990s. But I say that just because I want you to be thinking about how much does a lobbying communication cost, because that is going to be relevant to how much it costs against your cap. Let's take a look at another example here. Senator Warner, defund ICE / CBP, hashtag free them all. So what do we have here? We've got a communication to the general public, because we've got a sign, right? Is it expressing a view about specific legislation? Yes, because defund anything is basically saying, hey, Congress, in your next appropriations bill, do not put any money for ICE or for the Bureau of Prisons, right? So that is specific legislation, even though it doesn't have a bill number or anything like that. So communication to the general public expressing a view about specific legislation. Does this have a call to action? The answer, as you can probably tell by my premature circle here, is it does. This is an example of an indirect call to action. So this sign, this participation, if this costs money for a 501c3 organization, this would be considered grassroots lobbying because of the nature of the communication. It's got all of the elements all together, and whatever this costs, again, if this was by the C3, then that would count as grassroots lobbying for how much it cost. Turns out that this was actually volunteers doing this activity. volunteers cost the organization, well, nothing. With one potential caveat here. If your organization has a staff member that's organizing volunteers, of course, that staff time organizing a volunteer grassroots lobbying effort, that small amount of money would count against it. But the nice thing here is none of the volunteer time would count because it's zero. Multiply anything by zero, it's zero. So that's why it's really great to be operating under these rules, because you can really reduce the amount of impact on your grassroots lobbying cap, in this instance, or your direct lobbying cap, depending on what you're doing, by using as many cost-free elements as you possibly can. Because again, if it doesn't cost money, it doesn't count against your lobbying cap, even if it includes lobbying activity. So that's a really good example right there. Let's take a look at another example. Now, this was a retweet here, but, and I mentioned the retweet before I talk about the different various calls to action in here. In a digital space, one thing you want to be mindful of is that if you retweet anything, and I'm going to talk about this again later in the presentation as well, if you retweet anything, if you link to anything, the rules are it's incorporated by reference as a part of your communication. What does that mean? It means that whatever you are linking to, whatever you're retweeting, whatever you're doing, that is considered the same communication as if you said it. So you got to be mindful when you do all of these things, especially on social media, that you might be retweeting a grassroots lobbying message, and that might be something that you'll have to track and take account of. Now, how much money, how much time does a retweet count against you? Well, not a lot. So it depends on how much you do in any given month, year, or whatever. But it does add up. So you got to be mindful of all of that. Notice the things that I circled here. Make the call to Adelanto City Mayor. Call or text Mayor Gabriel Reyes. So explicit ask and the mechanism with the phone number here, and a script. Hello, my name is blank, and I'm calling from blank to urge the mayor to take action by saying no to a GEO expansion. All of these things are calls to action. If this required legislative lobbying at the city council level, then this would be considered grassroots lobbying activity because of it. So calls to action, very, very important in your analysis. If you've got them paired with a communication to the general public expressing a view about specific legislation, you've got grassroots lobbying. What happens, however, if you knock that out? Well, it's the same story as before. As I mentioned, if you're missing an element, then what you're doing, I don't care what you call it, you could call it advocacy, you could call it education, you could call it whatever, it's not lobbying activity because what you're doing doesn't meet the definition of lobbying. So things that don't count as calls to action, anything that I talked about on that prior slide before all of our examples. So things that don't count, learn more, take action, support our efforts, send us a check, get involved, join us. Anything that doesn't fit those other categories, that's not a call to action for purposes of this law. I know that call to action is, especially in the organizing community, has a very different meaning, but a call to action is a matter of law here. None of these things count as that. So these types of things don't count as lobbying. You can do as much as you want. Let's take a look at an example from OTI. OTI joins public knowledge in 200 plus organizations and businesses calling Congress to include support for broadband access in the next stimulus bill. Hashtag we need broadband, and then a link to the press release. We joined, and then the infographic there essentially says the same thing. Okay, so what do we have here? We've got communication to the general public, right? Because it's tweet. Expressing a view about specific legislation? Yes, because what we're asking Congress here is to include support for broadband access in the next stimulus bill. Next stimulus bill is legislation. Even though it isn't written yet, even though it hasn't been drafted yet, this is a policy proposal, a specific policy proposal, solving a problem that can only be done in this instance here through legislation. The solution that you're offering can only come through legislation. So yes, you are communicating to the general public, expressing a view about specific legislation, and then what? Is there a call to action in here? Well, I'm here to tell you there isn't. So this is a great example of non-lobbying advocacy work. Interestingly, what do you think? Do you think the general public, folks that are following OTI on Twitter, would be like, well, I just don't know what to do? Well, no, of course they're going to know what to do in a lot of ways. You're just not telling them to do it. So your activity, it's not grassroots lobbying because you stopped short of that last piece there, that call to action. But this type of work is important because it sets the table. It is advocacy. It is putting out your policy agenda. Just because it doesn't count as lobbying doesn't mean it's not important advocacy work. This is non-lobbying advocacy work at its finest right here. It could be paired with other lobbying activities later, but this communication right here, not lobbying, you can do as much of this type of stuff as you'd like. I want to talk about something that I mentioned earlier, and that is the lobbying exceptions. Now, I'm going to cover just the top two of these because the last two, they're a little bit more technical, and frankly, the last one isn't even real. It basically just says if it doesn't meet the definitions of lobbying, it's an exception. Well, we kind of already knew that. Self-defense is very, very specific, and I'm just going to leave that out for the moment. We've got some materials that I'm going to highlight at the end of the session where you can read more about it if you're super into completism and knowing all about this. First one I'm going to talk about is the nonpartisan analysis, study, or research. This is frankly the most important one that's out there. These are essentially the types of reports that you put out and other nonprofits put out. A lot of research-based entities and education-based C3s will make their bread and butter of advocacy doing this type of stuff. What is it? It's a report that has a full and fair discussion. So there's a content prong here. You got to have full and fair discussion. What does that mean? It means that you can have a point of view. You can even, quote unquote, solve a problem through legislation, proposed legislation. But what you can't do is you can't ignore other potential solutions to the problem that you're identifying. It doesn't mean that you have to champion another option. In fact, you should champion your point of view. You can even dismiss the other points of view, but you've got to do it in a way that's factual. You can't just ignore it. You can't say the only way that we do this is by spending more money. If there are other options that are out there, you should at least raise them in your report, and most importantly, you should dismiss them, because if it's not your preferred policy solution, you should say what they are and then dismiss them. So it's actually a very effective bit of advocacy for you as well. That's the content prong, full and fair discussion. The next one is the distribution prong, and that is you've got to get this thing out broadly. It's got to be broadly disseminated. You can put it on the internet. You can do a print run and distribute it out. The most important thing about this is that you're not just giving this to members of the legislative body that you're targeting on all of that. If you're doing that, you're in direct lobbying territory. But if you get this out to the general public as an educational piece, well, you fit fully in an exception, the nonpartisan analysis, study, or research exception. You're allowed to express a view. You're allowed to be very, very, you're allowed to champion it. You're allowed to make sure that everyone knows what your preferred policy strategy is. You can dismiss all other solutions out there. You can also, remember when I told you to dog ear the indirect call to action? You can identify in Appendix A, for instance, if you'd like, the members of the committee that might be voting on this piece of legislation that you're proposing. That you can include in there. So that is nonpartisan analysis, study, or research. By the way, this doesn't have to be just a printed material. You could conceivably do this as a presentation, a video, a webinar. They all can fit within the nonpartisan analysis, study, or research exception. You just got to make sure that it's full and fair discussion and broadly disseminated. And then you're in an accepted lobbying territory. You can do as much of this as you want. Oh, by the way, this has a bit of synergy to it as well. So what you've just done is you've created what's effectively a soft lobbying document. It doesn't count as lobbying, but this is a really important piece of policy advocacy. Well, you're going to broadly disseminate this out. And so maybe this is going to end up going to your allies, to some other folks that you work with on the issue. And maybe they're going to go in on their direct lobbying visits, and they're going to have this report that they didn't spend a dime on, right? You're not the one going in there doing the lobbying. They're taking your report and they're not, they're utilizing it for their lobbying activity, and it's going to help them succeed. And the beauty of that is that they didn't spend any money on it, so it doesn't count against their lobbying expenditure if they're a 501c3 organization. So you just help them out. The other interesting thing is just because they're taking your report and going in and lobbying, it does not come back to you. It doesn't count against your lobbying. So there's a great deal of synergy that happens here when you do these types of reports. They're really, really important. And if I'm ever presenting before organizations that don't don't do lobbying activity, I really encourage them to do this type of work because it still doesn't count as lobbying, but it's incredibly important advocacy, and it can help out other organizations lobbying because of the nature of its dissemination. So one of the most important things that you could do as a nonprofit, as a C3, this type of nonpartisan analysis, study, or research. All right, let's take a look at one other exception that can sometimes be helpful for you. Let's say that you were invited to testify before a congressional committee on broadband access, for instance. There's the example that I keep going to for you all. If you were invited in writing by the chair of the committee, and it could be a committee, a subcommittee, whatever governmental agency, this, to the extent that this is done maybe at a local level, local, state, whatever, that all can fit in this area too. You got to be invited in writing, and that is a strict requirement by the chair of that committee or the head of that governmental agency. And then if you testify or you provide information, it's got to be available to everybody in that governmental body, committee, subcommittee, or whatever. If that's the case, you're allowed to give a point of view on specific legislation. So in other words, you're allowed to engage in what would otherwise be direct lobbying, but because you've done it in this way, because you've been invited in writing by the chair of that committee or that subcommittee, it doesn't count. So all the travel costs, all the prep costs, all the actual time in there, none of that counts as lobbying activity. Really great. Doesn't come up a lot. A lot of times people will ask me, hey, I've got a friend on the committee, or a friend of the organization sits on the committee. What if we get permission from that person? Well, they're not the chair, doesn't count. A lot of folks will say, what if we just have oral permission by the committee chair? That doesn't count. You need to get it in writing. Then folks will often ask me, can we solicit this letter? Can we ask for it? We've been invited, but we haven't gotten it from the chair of the committee. Yes, you can ask the chair. You can ask that chair's chief of staff, hey, can we get this in writing? Because turns out there's this technical assistance exception. We like to not count this as lobbying. 9 times out of 10, from what I've heard, folks who have gone this path, they'll get that in writing. So yes, you can solicit that. Nice, helpful, not earth-shattering in terms of the amount of lobbying activity it saves from counting, but can be pretty measurable when all is said and done. Technical assistance, really important. Last thing I'll say about this is that if you can't get this thing in writing, one thing I'll say is if you've been invited to testify before a committee on a legislative matter where you're considered an expert, frankly, that's one of the most important times for you to be lobbying. So just because you may not be able to finagle this exception, I would say that you really want to do this because, frankly, you're the issue matter expert in this instance, and you're going to be at least listened to by some members, if not all members of that committee. So this is a super important thing to do, even if you can't fall under this exception, to engage in grassroots lobbying at that time. I want to, before we get to our Q&A session, I want to spend a couple of minutes here on just muddying the waters up a little bit. Let's be honest. What I've been talking about for this entire, say 45 minutes or so is the federal tax law limits on lobbying activity. Now, as you noticed, this covers state, local, and federal stuff, and you are limited in how much lobbying you can do. But there's a whole bunch of things that don't fall underneath it. That's basically the summary of the last 45 minutes. So IRS, federal law, limits lobbying at all levels of government. Let's shift to the states for a moment. If you're engaged in any advocacy before state governments, well, there's one little extra wrinkle to all of this. I'm going to use an example like a state, like the state of California. State of California will say, let's say you're going before a regulatory agency in the state of California that is regulating rural broadband in that state, in the Golden State. Well, the IRS will say, that's state regulatory work. That doesn't count under our definition of lobbying. We don't want to hear about it. But the state of California, I will be here to tell you, definitely wants to know that you're lobbying before their regulatory body. Doesn't count as lobbying under the federal rules, but the state of California wants you to register and report as an executive branch lobbyist. And this is going to be true across a lot of different states. So if you're doing state advocacy work, you want to be careful to know whether or not something counts for reporting and registration requirements in the state or sometimes even the local level. City of San Francisco, for instance, has local lobbying rules that you've got to comply with as well. There may be things where the feds say, we don't care, we can't be bothered, that's not under the law. But the state or the local level will say, yeah, we want to hear about this. So you're going to have to make sure that your timesheets and your methods of tracking all of this accommodates for that. So that's one little area of wrinkle there. Last but not least, there is an additional layer of lobbyist registration on the federal level. If you lobby a ton at the federal level, I'll just leave it at that. It's basically if you're lobbying over $13,000 and what a person is spending 20% of their time in front of Congress in some way, shape, or form, you may have to register and report under the Federal Lobbying Disclosure Act. That's sort of outside the scope of all of this, but something to be mindful of. It's something that if you can avoid it, and by saying avoiding it, I mean if you could spread out the staff contacts a little bit so that you don't have a single person who's doing 20% of their time, that's probably for the better. We can talk more about that. And of course, we've got some publications that talk about that as well. The only reason why I mention is it's just more reporting burden on you as an organization. So if it's something that you can shuffle around and avoid, you probably want to do that. It's probably in your best interest to do that. But if you do have to, you definitely need and want to comply. All right, so we are at about 5 minutes of 3. So let's take some questions about lobbying activity, and then we're going to take a break, and then we're going to come back and do election-related activity. But for now, I think, Chaya, are you going to be adminning the Q&A for me here?
Yes, I am. Thank you so much, Tim, for all of that. It was really interesting. So I have a few questions that I've been collecting thus far. If you have more, please add them either to the chat or the Q&A so we can get to them all before we get to our break. So the first question is that since New America is composed of different issue area specific programs, does it matter how much money or time one New America program spends on lobbying versus another?
So it ends up being aggregated across all of the different programs. Alliance for Justice, as I mentioned, we have two basic programs. And so how much lobbying one side or the other does, it's all aggregated into the one lobbying limit for our organization. Same thing applies to New America as well. So so long as the aggregate, all of the lobbying all put together is below your overall lobbying limit, you're in fine shape. So some programs that you do may not engage in any lobbying activity. Others may engage in much more as a percentage of what they do, but it's the aggregate across the entire organization.
Great, thank you. Next question. Does the ratio between direct or grassroots stick regardless of how much we end up spending on lobbying? I.e., if we are capable of spending $1 million total with $250,000 on grassroots, but only end up spending $200K on direct lobbying, can we still spend $250,000 on grassroots, or does that ratio shift?
I'm going to do the rare thing for a lawyer. I'm going to give a one-word answer. Yes, you can do the full 250 on grassroots lobbying. That is a calculation based on your overall limits. So you could engage in $0 of direct lobbying and still do 250,000 of grassroots lobbying. How much you spend on direct, it doesn't matter. But the absolute hard cap that you've got, the two caps that you have, 250,000 on grassroots lobbying and $1 million total. So, for instance, if you maxed out completely, you could do 750 direct and 250 on grassroots. What that mix ends up being, what you end up doing, doesn't impact or change those limits at all. So again, if you want to do 90% of your cap space, of your grassroots cap space, and only 2% of your direct lobbying cap space, no problem. Those things are determined based on how much overall your organization is spending in that year.
Great, thank you. Next question. Are regulatory agencies, for example, the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, or the Federal Trade Commission, considered legislators?
Never. Yeah, well, hold on. Lawyers never say never, right? They are in 99% of the time, those agencies are not considered legislators. There is in very limited circumstances. Let's say that the chair of the FCC is involved heavily in the writing of legislation around broadband access. That's before Congress, hypothetically. If you're communicating with the chair of the FCC in that instance about that piece of legislation that they are drafting, then the FCC chair would be considered a legislator in that one very, very narrow instance there. It's a pretty rare scenario. Otherwise, if you're talking about regulatory stuff, really anything else that's before an FCC chair or any regulatory body chair, it's never going to count as lobbying activity because it's not going to be considered legislation that's at issue. So very narrow slice where talking to a federal or state or local regulatory body where it would be considered lobbying activity at all for purposes of these rules.
Thank you. So now I have a couple of questions around tweeting. If a tweet isn't lobbying in and of itself, but links to another org's website that is lobbying, is the tweet then lobbying?
And then yes, I would say under most circumstances, yes, because of the incorporation by reference rules.
Great, thank you. And the next question is, does mentioning or tagging a legislator by name in a tweet affect whether the tweet is considered lobbying?
It may, because that could be an example of an indirect call to action. Remember back to our sign that we had? It would take me forever to flip back through the slide. Senator Warner, defund ICE. Same idea in the tweet there, but just put a little @ symbol in front of Senator Warner. So it would be identifying a legislator. So if you've got all the other elements of grassroots lobbying, let's say it's let's say that was change that into a tweet, that sign. That would still be considered grassroots lobbying because the call to action there is the identification of Senator Warner in our hypothetical tweet. That would be adding Senator Warner would be your indirect call to action. Yeah.
Thank you. And then one more question. Can you elaborate more, please, on the definition of specific policy proposal?
Sure.
I understood. Sorry, I'll just finish the rest of it.
Oh, yeah.
She says, I had already understood that pre-drafting conversations about legislation count, but it sounded like you were covering brainstorming sessions, like a conversation with a staffer about how Congress might address a particular problem. I thought the word specific in specific legislation would rule that out from counting.
I think that let me put it this way. I think that there are times when brainstorming sessions can get to the point where you are talking about specific policy proposals for purposes of the rule, because eventually you're going to get to a point in a brainstorming session where you're going to be advocating for something. Maybe not always. Maybe you end your brainstorming session and there's still a lot of question marks. You don't know where you're going to be coming out on as an organization, so you can't say that you're expressing a view about specific legislation, right? If it's just like, well, we're still trying to figure out what we are advocating for. We've identified a problem here, but we're not sure what the overall solution is, so we don't know if we've come out to support or oppose anything like that. That would be actually the instance where, remember how I said it's hard to not be supporting or opposing the legislation? That might be an instance where in a brainstorming session, that would be the difference between lobbying and not lobbying activity. But I will say a specific policy proposal is pretty, even though it's kind of a very broad definition, it does make some sense. The idea here is that if you identify a problem and the only solution, the solution that you propose can only be achieved through the passage of legislation, the IRS, Congress, tax law says, you know what, that's enough for it to be considered a legislative idea, a specific policy proposal. That's enough for this to be considered lobbying activity. Because basically, otherwise, you have the opportunity to kind of say, well, I didn't talk about that particular legislation because I didn't identify it by a bill number or by the title of it. They want to capture any advocacy where you are saying, hello, Senator, I've got an idea here and you need to pass a piece of legislation that contains this particular thing. That is lobbying under the rules. And I think that that's probably the earliest stage where something could be considered lobbying activity. The brainstorming sessions that the person who asked the question suggested, I think they could eventually get to that point, but maybe not always. And also somewhere, as I mentioned before, you may not feel comfortable or feel in a position on behalf of the organization to say yes or no to support to any of the ideas that are proffered in that kind of a brainstorming session. So I think that the answer is, and this is going to get to something I'm going to be talking about in the second half with election related stuff, it really is going to depend on the context of the communication, whether or not those brainstorming sessions are going to count.
Okay, and then we have a couple last questions that have come in about regulatory agencies. So would asking members of Congress to write to an agency about, such as the FCC, about a regulation or proceeding, would that be considered lobbying?
So if the proceeding is a rulemaking, executive branch rulemaking, notice and comment, and you're just trying to get a member of Congress to weigh in, that's not going to count because we don't have specific legislation. I want to actually throw in one other thing that wasn't part of the question, but it's important because this is really important from an advocacy perspective and also isn't lobbying when you're talking to legislators. Asking them to engage in oversight is not lobbying activity either because there's no specific legislation involved. It's Congress that's looking over part of their sort of oversight of executive branch agencies. That's a piece of our separation of powers based in the Constitution. That's not lobbying activity to go, hey, folks in Congress, we want you to do oversight on the FCC and how they're implementing pre-existing laws. That also would not be considered lobbying at all.
You actually beat me to the next question, and then one more came in, and then after this one, we will we'll take the break, and if we have any other questions, we'll answer them later. So feel free to continue sending questions about lobbying, but I think I'm going to stop asking questions so we can stay on schedule after this one. So the last question is it a specific policy proposal to ask a senator to send a letter to the FCC expressing displeasure about an FCC rulemaking? Although never made explicit, these letters often have the implied threat that Congress could take legislative action to override the FCC if they don't do what the senator asks.
I think so long as it's not explicit, that last part isn't made explicit, you're not saying, hey, member of Congress or hey, senator, will you make sure that you put that in your letter? I think that if you're saying, if you're advocating for legislation to be passed, that would be different. That would be considered lobbying activity. But as the question has been asked, I would say would not be considered lobbying activity. It's oversight. It's using the power of the bully pulpit that some members of Congress have since they're on oversight committees, for instance, for these types of things. That just doesn't count as lobbying activity. Really important, great advocacy work may make a substantial difference in how policy is done at the FCC level in this instance, but wouldn't count as lobbying activity. We're going to be talking about the second part of the rules of the game, election season advocacy. I'm going to be talking about some of the rules around a lot of what you can't do, because that's sort of how the rule is written. But I'm going to spend as much time as I can possibly to talk more about what you can do around election season on the topics that we're covering this time around. Let's jump in here. I'm not going to go through this in the line by line manner. What I really want to underscore here is the distinction in that bottom row. 501c3 public charities like your organizations and my organization, Alliance for Justice, like CLF, we are absolutely prohibited from doing anything that supports or opposes a candidate for public office. In other words, all of our activities have to be strictly nonpartisan. Just because you're getting involved with candidates doesn't necessarily mean you're acting in a partisan way. There's a whole host of things that we can do as 501c3s around elections. But the big rule is you're just not allowed to do anything that's partisan in nature. And as we'll talk about in a few minutes, you can't even do it in a way that's sort of on the snide. You know, it can't even smell like you're doing anything to support or oppose candidates. And I'll get much more into the details on all of that when we talk. You may notice that there are other types of nonprofits that are engaged in partisan political activity, especially and notably in the conservation and environmental movement. There's tons of organizations that will get out and do endorsements. They'll do issue advocacy that it clearly shows preference for or against candidates. That's because they're not 501c3s. They're 501c4 organizations. And as a secondary part of what they do, tax law says, yeah, you're allowed to do things that support or oppose candidates. So if you're ever a little bit confused as to why you can't do things that other groups can do, it's because your tax treatment is different. You're allowed to take donations and confer tax deductibility to those donations. C4s, 527s, the other types of political groups that are allowed to do partisan work, they can't do that, and that's the real big difference there. Let's spend some time on these rules. Reminder, 501c3s can be active participants in election season. In fact, I feel like it's a disservice to your community and the issues that you're working on to cede the territory of election season to other types of organizations. You are experts. You need to be engaged and active during election season. But as I said before, you are just simply not allowed to support or oppose candidates running for public office. There's a lot of space between those two poles. Now, as I mentioned, the whole analysis of this rule seems like kind of a bright line rule, right? You're not allowed to support or oppose candidates. It seems like it should be very clear what one side is and what the other is. But as it turns out, this is an area of law where the IRS applies what we call facts and circumstances analysis. And what that essentially means is that it looks at all of the factors, all of the things that your organization is saying, all of the things that the candidates are saying, and it looks at it in context together. Some communications that I'm going to be talking about today, in fact, I've got at least one example. Some communications are really, really safe to do away from an election, but become progressively riskier as you get closer to an election. And there are certain factors where if you knock out one piece of the communication, it's perfectly safe. But if you keep including it, it may become what I like to call a red light scenario, or something that's a very risky scenario for a 501c3. The one thing that I really like to emphasize here is that context matters in all of this, but your intent does not. I'll repeat that. Context matters. Everything that's going on matters. But the fact that you don't intend to support or oppose a candidate in your communication is not a factor that the IRS looks at. So sometimes you may say, look, we were intending on this just being an issue advocacy piece. We only care about the issue. We don't care about the election. I mean, we sort of do in a sense that we want folks to be elected that will support our positions, but that's not what the purpose of this whole thing is. Well, from the IRS perspective, they don't care whether your intent was not to influence an election. They just care if it looks like you did. So really important takeaway on that. So here's the deal with all of the different topics for 501c3 election related activity. For this session, for the rest of the hour, we're going to be talking about issue advocacy during an election season, voter education, and candidate education. These are three things, well, actually, all five of these things, actually, I guess there's six. All of these things you can do as a 501c3. You just got to make sure you're not doing anything that looks like you're supporting or opposing a candidate. Let's talk about issue advocacy, because frankly, I think this is the most important thing for folks in 501c3s to understand, that you can continue to push your policy proposals and to oppose bad ones all the way through election season. It is a misnomer that 501c3s need to shut down during election season. You may need to alter some of the things that you're saying and how you're saying them, but you absolutely can continue your advocacy on issues through election season just by following the general rule, which is don't look like you're supporting or opposing a candidate. Here's how we do that. Guidelines that I would have you follow. You want to focus more on issues than criticizing or supporting people that are running. So in other words, as long as you're focused on issues, it's more likely than not that the IRS is going to find that to be a favorable thing. You want to avoid talking about issues in a way that seems like a candidate's qualifications. In fact, that's actually a really central theme for most of the IRS rulings in this area. You want to avoid referring to voters or the election. Now, that may be kind of hard, of course, when you're talking about voter education and things like that. So this is not an absolute, but when you combine issue advocacy with the election, that tends to work against you, in terms of the analysis. The closer you are to the election, I talked about this before, you want to avoid identifying a candidate by name or image. And there's some things that we can do to kind of massage that a little bit so that You're more likely to be focused on issues rather than candidacies, even if they are sitting incumbents. That's the trickiest thing, right? If you've got a sitting incumbent that you've been critical of on issues for the entire term that they've been in office, just because they're running for re-election doesn't mean that you have to stop. But as we get closer to the election, you want to massage things a little bit to make sure that folks are very clear that you're talking about the issues, not that impending candidacy for re-election. Last but not least, this isn't always true, but disclaimers are sometimes helpful. Every once in a while, when I see something that is sort of close to the line where I would say, the IRS might consider this to be something that would be more risky. Sometimes a disclaimer can be very helpful because what it can do is it can say, hey, we're a 501c3, we're worried about the issues, nothing that we do should be taken as support or opposition to a candidate. Now, that's not a talisman that you could just hang up on a wall and assume that you can beat away by making an endorsement for a candidate, which is sort of like the third rail of doing anything for a C3. A disclaimer is not going to help you over something like that. That's that obvious. A disclaimer, though, might be helpful in certain circumstances, and I'll probably cover a few of those as we get going a little bit further on down the line here. Simple, quick guidelines for you. On the screen before you right now is a tweet from CLF. Senators Ron Wyden and Jeff Merkley have introduced legislation to legislate. I got to look at my big screen. Pardon me for looking away from the camera. Have introduced legislation to make permanent the Oahe region of Oregon. One special attraction in this high desert, the 750-mile Oregon Desert Trail. Read more in that Oregon Life link, and then a couple of hashtags as well. In January of 2020, when this is put out, this, I would say, is absolutely green light. Notice how this all looks. It's very focused on the issues. It is mentioning two sitting senators, but it's mentioning them in the context of the legislation. This is a classic issue-based communication that would be okay last year, and I think all the way up through the time that this tweet went out. But let's change the facts a little bit here, and I think that this will maybe show how context matters in the analysis of all of this. Let's assume, let's get in a time machine and go forward to October 2020. You may want to join me in all of this because there's a lot of things that are going to be happening between now and October, but here we are, October 2020. What changes given the proximity to the upcoming election? Well, there's two names on this tweet here that are of note. Both of them are sitting Oregon senators. Well, Ron Wyden is not up for re-election this fall, but Jeff Merkley is. So when you align a communication that's issue-based, that shows support of a single issue with someone who is running for re-election, all of a sudden that changes the analysis. I think that you could very easily say Senator Ron Wyden has introduced new legislation, and that's still a green light. He's not running for re-election. This has nothing to do with the election whatsoever. Nobody could take it that way. But I would say by mentioning Senator Merkley closer to the election, that could be perceived as showing support for Senator Merkley's re-election. Now, one other thing, you could make an argument that since Senator Merkley is facing, I think if I'm not mistaken, at least some tacit primary challenges right now, there are some situations coming as we get closer to Oregon's primary where you want to be a little bit careful too. Remember, primaries are as much elections as general elections are. But just to put aside that complication to here, I know that come October, it's likely that he's going to be the Democratic nominee, and you can kind of see how that could be taken as a potential support of the candidacy. Again, remember, context matters, intent does not. So that's why I give it a yellow light in all of this. What would be a way to make this tweet be perfectly safe and absolute green light by making one simple change? That would be by removing the reference to Senator Merkley. Just talking about Senator Wyden would be perfectly fine, not running for re-election. Talking about an issue, that would make it a pure green light. That's why I give this kind of a combo yellow and green light. So again, context really matters when it comes to these types of things. And this is an example of shifting the timeline a little bit can make a difference between a green light and a yellow light. I'm going to use this to reiterate once again a rule that I talked about before. If you are retweeting something in any context, it's considered incorporated by reference. So OTI retweets this, OTI owns this communication as well. Turns out somebody works for OTI, so yeah, it probably works either way, but I guess this is a personal account or In any event, OTI retweeting it incorporates this by reference. It's the same thing as if they said it itself. So let's take a look here. We can put the poll up as well if we want. Michael Calabrese tweets, right, all Americans except the 40, this is in response, FCC commissioner, our agency says all, poll just blocked my view. Okay, there we go, now I can read. FCC commissioner, our agency says all Americans are gaining advanced internet access. It's wrong. Link to the CNN article. Michael writes, right, all Americans except the 40 million without broadband internet, according to Broadband Now research study using more objective data at OTI. So adding OTI back. When OTI tweets this out, do you think that this is a red light, high risk for election-related stuff, yellow light, maybe some mixed risk, or green light? This is all A-okay. I'll give you all a few minutes or a few moments here to come up with your answers on this. I'll talk a little bit about this while you're answering. First thing that you'll look at is the timing. We're way away from an election. Second thing, do you see any references to an election whatsoever? No. Do you see any references to anyone who's running for election? No. In fact, even the FCC commissioner is not mentioned by name in all of this. So what I would say in all of this, and hopefully I've given you all enough time on this, that this is the type of communication that is absolutely green light, no problem whatsoever. So would this ever be considered something that could slide into yellow or red light? Yeah, if broadband internet access ended up being something that was really, really important between any federal candidates, for instance, if the FCC commissioner was running for office, that could possibly be something. But for the moment, in this context, full green light. This is the type of stuff, this is kind of the bread and butter of the type of advocacy that you do anyways. So I would say that this is definitely going to be an okay type of a thing. So I don't know. Well, what do we have here? 92% of you green lighted it. Very good, very good. All right, National Parks Conservation Association. So it was put out September 29th of last year, right? Video, our parks are literally being uprooted. Land along the border is being scraped to create a habitatless barrier and space for the border wall. And our iconic, delicate, and protected species are being transplanted in the process. And there's a link to, I believe, the video on that, and adding Organ Pipe National Park. If you have not been to Organ Pipe National Park in Arizona, it is one of the most magical places on the face of this earth. It is gorgeous. It is also, by an unfortunate quirk of its geography, right on the US-Mexican border. Because it is federally owned land, it's super, super easy for the president to put in the border wall in that area because it's federally owned land. There's no not having to do eminent domain on private land, et cetera, et cetera. So as a result, this administration last year started literally uprooting these endangered cacti to put up the border fence. So National Parks Conservation Association was, understandably from their perspective, very much against this. So what are some things we want to take a look at here? Is this close to an election? No, not even remotely. Is this the type of thing that is mentioning an election at all? No. Is it mentioning anybody who's running? No. One thing I want you to see, though, is, or I want to highlight, is the border wall. Oh, then I blew the poll again for you. Sorry about that. The border wall, yeah, go ahead and vote green light. We'll get 100% on this. This is an okay type of a thing, but I do want to highlight this by saying that the border wall mention is something that I would consider potentially getting to the point where it could be a yellow light scenario if the timing on this were different. Just mentioning a really contentious issue that is such a big deal in an election, it's hard. Now, granted, with all the coronavirus stuff, I think that has become the #1 big ticket issue that the president will be running on and around and near. But prior to that, I think immigration and the wall in general probably is it. It's such a divisive issue, and it's so associated with President Trump that even mentioning this in any kind of a context could be considered in certain ways a proxy to show support or opposition for someone's candidacy here. In this instance, however, National Parks Conservation Association has a massive track record protecting national parks and wanting to make sure that they are all of the protected species that are a part of them are protected in every way, shape, or form. So I think taking a stance on removing them from the public lands there for any reason, whether it's a border wall or not, I think ends up being pretty much a green light, especially in this context here. I would say you start mentioning President Trump in there, you start adding a few other things in here, you could get to a yellow light scenario very, very quickly and easily. So I say these things, and I've got a few more examples as well. Again, just to underscore, this is a very subjective analysis, but the look and feel of things, it is, that old phrase of, you know it when you see it. You get to a point when you start working in this area that there is, we used to describe it this way, we used to teach it this way, that there's a smell test. If you get even a whiff of partisan activity off of something, chances are you're at least in a yellow light territory. Here, I just don't get that, even though it mentions the border wall, but you can't talk about this issue without mentioning it, because the reason these cacti are being plucked out of the ground is because of the border wall construction. So you gotta mention it as part of it. But big ticket issue, definitely can't divorce that from the president and his stance. That's potentially a factor that could work against you. Okay, enough on cacti. All right, here we go. I'm not going to step on this one. Vote away on this poll. Dump Trump 2020 or keep America great, Donald Trump. Or any kind of, picture anything where you are mentioning candidates in a way where you are mimicking their campaign slogans, whether you are doing something in a way where it's fairly obvious on the face of it how you feel about them as candidates, like on the top image. What do you think about this? Can you get within 2 area codes of activity like that? I'm hoping I get a lot of votes on one particular one here. All right, and it is. Thank you. 100% of you. You're absolutely right. 100%. This is a red light. You just can't. You can't come anywhere near this. And the interesting thing is that make a change to the top one there. It says dump Trump. It doesn't say vote against. It doesn't say defeat. It's not using what we use in election law, the so-called magic words. But dump Trump 2020 as a pretty clear indication by you as an organization, if you put it out as a C3, that you are opposed to the president's reelection. Just like aping the campaign slogan on the bottom would mean that you were very much for the president's reelection. Can't come anywhere near this. You can't do it. This is the easy stuff. And I use this as a highlight to show that it's kind of unusual that you're in a very clear red light territory without just really knowing it. A lot of stuff lives in that yellow light to green light territory that we do analysis on, because frankly, most organizations just don't get anywhere near this kind of thing if they're 501c3s. By the way, 501c4 organizations, C5, C6s, remember all the way back to that graph at the beginning, they absolutely can do this type of work. They're allowed to do this kind of thing. It just has to be a secondary amount of what they're doing. So if you do see nonprofits engaged in this activity, probably just means that they're non-501c3 groups. All right, I want to talk a little bit and spend a little bit more time reiterating, to a certain extent at least, some of the things that I've talked about with internet-based communications, social media, websites, whatever you're thinking of. You want to make sure in the social media context, so retweets, likes, links, that you know what you're liking, retweeting, and linking to. One of the questions in the lobbying section kind of touched on this. Remember, the IRS considers everything that you directly link to, however you do it, whichever context in social media that you do it in, it's a part of your own message. It's as if you said it yourself. So you have to be particularly careful when you're linking or liking or retweeting or sharing or whatever non-501c3 organizations. If you're doing it with a 501c3 organization, chances are, since they have to follow the same rules as you, it's probably safe for you to just do any kind of a retweet, like, or link. Otherwise, they would be acting outside of the bounds, and more likely that you won't mistakenly retweet, like, or link something that is out of bounds for you. Following and friending. You've got to be mindful of following and friending non-C3 organizations. Friending is a little bit different than following, and of course these are different, different platforms do different things. Just following a partisan source doesn't necessarily mean that you're crossing the line by any stretch of the imagination. But if you're friending, it's showing a friending in that kind of context looks like you're endorsing. You're saying, yes, I adopt this person's take. Following just might mean, hey, look, I follow. If you're opposed to the president's policies on broadband internet access, we keep using that as an example. Following at real Donald Trump does not necessarily mean that you're supporting him. You're just trying to see what he's saying next, right? So following is a little bit different than friending. Friending, you got to be much more careful of that. Be mindful when it's a non-C3 organization or a political entity. Organizations that do non-electoral advocacy, hey, friending them is almost always going to be okay. Following, almost always going to be okay. Purely partisan ones on the friending side of things, probably not okay. Following usually depends on the scenario. It depends on context. Remember, it depends. Official accounts and candidate accounts. I want to make sure that I highlight these two things, and I've got an example from recent history here. It's okay to follow or friend a lawmaker's official account. It's a much more risky proposition to follow or friend a candidate account. Let's use an example here. Elizabeth Warren, when she was running for president, this was her official campaign account, @eWarren. If you are following this account out of a 501c3, there's an element of risk to that. Why? Because it suggests that maybe you're showing some support for that. Following, though, isn't necessarily always a problem. You might have been just following because you're trying to figure out what her policy positions are on a variety of things that are part of her platform. I would say there's an element of risk, though, especially when you've got the other opportunity. Elizabeth Warren has an official Senate account. This is her elected position. This is her policy position Twitter account. Following or friending this is almost always going to be a green light. So given a choice between things out of a C3, and if you're trying to follow for policy related purposes, follow the official account. It's always a lot safer. If you've got a compelling reason to follow a candidate account, make sure that it's a for real reason, because again, there is some element of risk when you are getting involved. You're dipping a big toe into the political stuff, the partisan, electoral, political stuff of individual candidates. Candidate education is sort of the flip side of all of that. As a 501c3, you are indeed allowed to educate candidates and parties on your issues. And you are allowed to try to sway them to your point of view on all of this, even during election season. You want to make sure that you do one really important thing here, and that is if you're going to talk to one candidate, you want to make sure that you're offering the same information, the same opportunity to all of the viable candidates that are running for the same office. Why is that? The IRS takes a stance on this that says basically, you're not allowed to give a thing of value to one candidate. That kind of feels like, and I'll use a term that we use in election law, which is a separate set of laws, kind of feels like a contribution to that campaign. So you want to make sure that you're freely giving this information out to all of them in a nonpartisan way. Notice I use the term viable there. There's always folks that are running for office, not all the time, but many times, that are sort of what I like to call asterisk percenters, folks that are running for office constantly, never really have much of a chance. You're allowed to limit your participation in this candidate education work to just viable candidates, those that have a real chance of winning. And as long as you've got a nonpartisan way of calculating or figuring out what viable means for you, the IRS should be okay with that. You do not want to create any new or original information for any candidate that you're engaging this candidate education for. Why? Because that's something of value that if you're preparing specially for that candidate, that would be considered a problem from the IRS perspective because they're giving them something of value. That's no good. And then you may also be violating federal or state, depending on the office that's at issue here, election laws or campaign finance laws, because corporations generally, and your corporation is a C3, aren't allowed to contribute to candidates at most levels, certainly at the federal level. So you don't want to do that. You may be violating a couple of laws there. You don't want to republish anything from a candidate or a campaign. Don't just take their information and say, oh yeah, this candidate had some really good ideas when we met with them. We just thought we would share it with all of you. What you just did right there, if you republish their campaign materials, that's basically re-amplifying their message, their campaign message. That's a problem. That becomes an IRS problem potentially as well. So let's fast forward. you've gotten through the election. Everybody hopefully has been declared victors, which this year may take a little while in some instances for a variety of reasons I won't get into. Now we're in transition team time. So the folks that got elected now are building their teams. They're building their offices. They're trying to get ready. They're trying to get organized for when they take office. This is a great and critical time for you to act as a 501c3 organization, because it's totally okay for you to educate transition teams on issues important to your organization. Hey, congratulations, you won. We sat out the election because we're not supposed to support or oppose you, but now that you're in office, we want to talk to you about all of the issues that we care about, and we would love to offer you tons of guidance and tons of information on all of this. You're allowed to recommend transition team members, recommend key members of the cabinet if that's relevant to the office holder that you're talking to. That's all totally fine. You want to be mindful that some of this might count as lobbying activity, depending on the nature of it. Some of the advocacy may fall under some of the exceptions that we talked about if you present it properly. So I would refer you back to the first hour of our conversation for any of those types of things. But transition team advocacy is a great time and a perfect time for you to get the foot in the door early for folks that have been newly elected, especially brand new folks. Everything that I've talked about, and this is the last couple of slides before we get into Q&A. So definitely, I've noticed you've got some questions coming in. Please keep them coming. Everything that I've talked about is about 501c3s. All of these rules apply organizationally to 501c3s and to the staff that run them, right? So what they don't cover are for you as an individual acting in your own personal capacity on your own time. You are allowed to take a stance. You're allowed to write a check. You're allowed to go volunteer for the candidates of your choice. It's First Amendment protected activity. Just because you work for a C3 doesn't mean you can't, on your own time and with your own money, etc., go and support a candidate or party that's important to you. You can still do that. Here's a few things that you want to keep in mind with all of that. Do not use your organization resources. Don't do it on staff time. Don't use the New America email. Don't use the copier to the extent we have access to copiers anymore. Just don't use organization resources when you're doing stuff on your own time, because what you'd be doing is you'd be spending organization resources, C3 money, on partisan activity, and you just can't do that. That's just not allowed. Don't use organization resources when you're doing stuff on your own time. Number two, it may be that you need to distinguish yourself as an organization from being an organizational representative versus you as an individual. If you're the type of person that walks into a room, and I know I'm not this guy, but if you walk into a room and somebody cannot distinguish between you as an individual and acting on your own time and New America doing stuff, so you may be a higher up officer or director or something like that in the organization, if that matches you, you may need to say, hey, everybody, if you're at a house party, for instance, for, I know Ward 2 in DC is electing a potential, or there's an election for Ward 2 right now for our DC council member. And, if you're at a house party supporting the Ward 2 council member of your choice, you may walk in there and say, hey, I know you think of me as Tim Mooney, the Tim Mooney from Alliance for Justice, but I'm actually here on my own time because I support this particular Ward 2 candidate. I may need to do that from time to time to make sure that people don't confuse that I'm there representing Alliance for Justice or you with New America or whatever entity we're talking about. You may want to use disclaimers as it's appropriate, especially in that context. Let's say that you're a part of a fundraising committee, again, on your own time, in your own way. And again, you're the type of person that you need to be divorced from the organization. People need to know that it's not New America that's there. That's part of the fundraising committee for this particular candidate. May list your name, comma, New America, and say an asterisk, organization name for identification purposes only. That's actually IRS approved for people in that scenario. Why? It's a way of what I call hanging a lantern on your problem. The hanging a lantern on your problem rule. It's saying, yes, it's that person from that organization, but it's saying very explicitly, no, they're here acting in an individual capacity. The organization is not doing anything that supports or opposes this candidate. If you're presenting at some kind of a fundraiser event or something like that, and you're saying, hi, I'm here to introduce this person that I really would like to win here in Ward 2, but I just want to mention I'm not here representing my 501c3 right now. I'm here at this event as a private citizen. That would be something that might be something you may want or need to do. Last but not least, you got to remember what hat you have on when, which is an excuse for me to put up Derby Day hats of these fabulous women. Look at those hats. I learned about this recently, and I am just in awe and inspired. Princess Beatrice is on the lower right there. That is a hat for the ages. Know what hat you are wearing when. Everybody that I'm talking to in this room, virtual room right now, has at least two hats. You have a 501c3 hat that you represent when you're representing the organization. You have a personal hat for when you're on your own time. If you're doing this kind of stuff, make sure you've got your personal hat on, not your 501c3 hat. Nobody is representing with a hat quite like Princess Beatrice. That is everything. All right, real quick, questions we're going to get to in a moment here. I know we're tight to the top of the hour. I will continue past 4 o'clock, but I want to make sure that I honor your time. If anybody has 4 o'clock meetings or whatnot, please feel free to go and do them. I will not feel upset or ashamed or embarrassed, but I want to make sure I answer all the questions, so I will go past 4 to answer all of them. These are resources for you if you would like them. Our relationship does not end today. You can call or email us at Alliance for Justice, the Boulder Advocacy attorneys, myself included, or one of my colleagues. We answer questions on this stuff every day, Monday through Friday. We can't be your lawyers, but we can help answer these lawyers as part of a technical assistance project that we've got. Numbers are there. We also have a ton of resources. If 2 hours of tax law was not enough for you, I have good news for you. We have publications that are free. You can download them on election-related activity, which was the second half. That's called Rules of the Game. We have a publication. The other one is called Being a Player on lobbying activity. You can and tons of fact sheets on all sorts of very drilled down elements within all of these areas. Go check that out at boulderadvocacy.org. Next up, questions. Again, questions. Feel free to leave. You have to do it for, but I'm here for however long we have questions for. So, Chaya, do you want to start off with the first one?
Sure. Thank you so much. That was super interesting. So as I just put in the chat, I'm going to focus right now on the questions on organizational activity, because I think you preemptively covered a bunch of the questions that were submitted on personal political activity and those lines. If that is not the case, and if he didn't preemptively answer all of that, please resubmit that question just so I know that we need to address it. So let's see here. So if a reporter asks for a New America program's views on a candidate's new proposal, for example, to expand access to early childhood learning, what can we say?
So great question, comes up all the time. This is a good example of a scenario where you can kind of preempt everything by saying, a reminder, we're a 501c3 organization and we don't take a stance on candidacies or for or against candidacies. And then what you can do is just pivot to the issue as an issue and say, our stance on issue X is blank. That would be a way for you to do that. You do run the risk of, in that scenario, of unintentionally looking like you're supporting the candidate that agrees with your point of view, or unintentionally opposing the candidate that comes against you. So I think that making sure that you include that disclaimer can be a really important thing as a part of it. Hopefully it gets presented in a way that is so that it doesn't look like that in any article that a member of the media is doing. But I think that if you make sure that you take care to do that, then you should be in good shape.
Thank you. So next, yes, sorry, I was still unmuted. So next, Ken OTI put out comments evaluating or comparing different candidates' proposals for an issue related to our work. For example, comparing their positions on government use of facial recognition.
So this is an area that could get into some yellow light territory, and I'll explain why. If you combine discussion of an evaluation of two candidates' points of view, especially if they differ a lot, if there's a real pivot point between their points of view, one side and another side. If it's one of those things where it's sort of like it's a real shades of gray, this is a complicated issue, I think things tend to be a little bit safer. But if you've got an issue where candidate A really, really supports something, candidate B really, really opposes something, and you're on one of those two sides, going through and talking about those two candidates and vis-a-vis that issue, and then underscoring, oh, by the way, we happen to agree with this one candidate. That can be seen as a tacit endorsement if it's presented in the wrong way. And that's why, generally speaking, if you are in a scenario where you are addressing the distinction between candidates' points of views on an issue that you care a lot about, you may be better served talking about this divorced from the candidates themselves. Because if it does look like that you would be presenting your point of view on that issue in the context of this election with those candidates, and it would look like, oh yeah, we really end up agreeing the heck out of with this one candidate, but not the other one. And that's sort of the full text of that communication. That's the only thing that's there. That could be taken as a tacit endorsement. You got to be a little bit mindful of all of that. I'm not saying that you're never able to do that. I'm just saying that you want to make sure that you're presenting this in maybe either a broader context where maybe there's some agreement and disagreement and it's all over the map between the two candidates on a variety of issues. Remember, one of the factors that we talked about was broad range of issues. If you are able to do that, you're able to cover a broad range of issues. When you're looking at the facts and circumstances analysis, you're probably going to be better served by that. It's much more likely to be kind of like a green light or a very barely yellow light kind of a thing. You could run into it where it's just one particular issue, one candidate you super agree with, one candidate you super disagree with, and it goes out there. It might look like you're supporting one candidate and opposing a candidate. So context really matters and how you go about doing it. So I think that the general answer is, I have to divert back to my magic 8-ball. It kind of depends.
So then what I'm hearing you say is that it is better to evaluate candidates perhaps on a broad range of issues.
Always.
Okay.
Always.
Perfect. Thank you. So a legal nonprofit we work with provided a legal opinion in a letter to a primary candidate released to the media by the organization, but at the same time, not after, the candidate announced a proposal saying that the policy is legal and providing the relevant legal analysis. They had supported the policy prior to the election and had made generally that legal argument before. Is there some way that's permissible activity?
I'm trying to follow this. It sounds like that we may be in some yellow light territory at the very least here, if I'm understanding this correctly. I think that any time that you are showing support for a candidate's position in an electoral context, it's sort of like the example that we had before, except there's just one candidate involved here. So I would say I think that there are scenarios where that could be problematic, that could be risky, or there could be scenarios where that, if presented in the proper way, might be green light territory. I feel like I would probably need a few more facts to be able to assess that properly. So again, here we are back to my magic 8-ball that says it depends. But I do think that there is a gamut, a range of possible outcomes with that type of a scenario.
Thank you. And if we have a follow-up, we can figure that out offline. Next question. A few years ago, the IRS was criticized for investigating 501c3s that had Tea Party in their name. They were suspected of doing electioneering activity. Fox News claimed that investigation was wrong and that the IRS was politically motivated. Are you at all concerned that the IRS under Trump could wrongly target 501c3s that have liberal affiliations?
Okay, that is a meaty question where I could go on for about an hour on this one, but I'll do the short version if I can possibly restrain myself. So the IRS has historically, since the 1970s, post-Watergate, been insulated from political activity at Treasury. That accusation was thin, to be perfectly honest. It could be explained more through just sort of normal malfeasance and normal bad actions, and that were not politically motivated. The interesting thing is this. I have heard through attorneys that practice in this area, who I respect a great deal, that they are catching wind of possibly that this administration is trying to, in certain ways, remove that wall between the political influence at Treasury and the IRS brick by brick. I don't think that we're there yet. I haven't seen any evidence of that yet, but that's what I'm hearing from people and attorneys that I really respect in this area. So I think it's something that we want to dog ear and keep an eye on. But I think for the moment, I don't think that there's any indication, as of right now, that the Internal Revenue Service is, because of the nature of because the president tends to lean more conservative, that they are going after liberal organizations, progressive organizations anymore than any other type at this point. I will say that accusation was not super credible when with any real analysis that was given to it the one few years back, but to be continued. And as the president of fund is saying, I will see what happens.
So there's a couple of questions around transition planning. So what are the rules or restrictions on 501c3s engaging in party platform drafting or presidential transition planning, whether that transition planning happens before or after the election? Because often transition planning, of course, starts many months out.
Exactly. Yeah. The rules are pretty much the same as what I talked about from the transition slide for party platform. You're allowed to engage, and in fact, there's tons of 501c3s that end up at the conventions. The question that I often get is, do we have to go to both of them if one party is amenable to our points of view and the other party is just not even going to bother listening? And the answer to that is, I would encourage you to give it a shot. Now, maybe your advocacy would differ to the party convention where they're maybe not as receptive to your policy proposals. Maybe there's another tack that you can take. Maybe there's another angle that you can take with folks like that. That would be the safest. That would give you the full green light. I think that if you only go to one party, it's still okay. I think, largely speaking, I think you might get a tinge of yellow light in the analysis because you're just going to say the Democratic convention. But you're still going to be arguing for policy proposals to folks that may be elected officials. So you're doing this from the perspective of support for issues and for your policy issues to go forward, not because you're saying, well, I'm here to help support your candidacy, because that's just not going to you're not going to do that. You can't do that as a 501c3. So I think that any element of risk for just the single party going to one convention is rather limited, but you can't ignore it. It's definitely there. But the rules are generally the same. You basically want to go there and you want to make the offer of information in a broad way. You don't want to create anything new for folks. You want to be going with basically the same type of materials that you would be doing for, well, basically you prepared before on these policy matters. That nonpartisan analysis, study, and research, that exception that I talked about, that big report, that's a great thing to bring to things like this because you prepared it in advance for a policy matter, and this is a great place to disseminate it. Remember, you got to get it out there in order for it to count as under that exception. So why not bring it to the party conventions too?
Thank you so much. Sorry, I'm trying to curate all the questions here. If you provide comment to a reporter about a candidate's bill, a candidate who's currently in office, and the disclaimer isn't published, can you get in trouble with the IRS?
I think that it would be really unlikely that the IRS would go after you on that. It's possible. Let's say that the way that the article is written, let's say you go through the whole thing. You say, hey, reporter, we're New America, we're C3, blah, blah, blah. And the reporter writes it up in a way that makes it seem like that you're supporting one of the people because it just textually, it's lost in there. What can happen there is sometimes, especially organizations that are against you might say, oh, look, they're supporting this candidate, and we've got this newspaper article that shows that, and maybe that would that complaint might turn into something. But generally speaking, what happens then is there would be an audit, there'd be an investigation, and I think that you would be very much you'd very much be in the clear if you followed all those things, saying, hey, we're C3, we're not supporting or opposing a candidate. This gets me to how aggressively this stuff is enforced. it said this before, it's just not enforced very strongly. The IRS is underfunded, and right now even more so than ever. And I think that there was a GAO report that came out in February, back before all of this happened, and it just showed that the enforcement numbers were really quite low. I think that you have to generally, to get the IRS's attention, you either have to do something super egregious that they can't ignore, or it's got to be done based on a complaint by somebody that probably doesn't like what you're doing. Um, Both of those scenarios are pretty limited. As somebody that used to work for an organization that would file IRS complaints, I'm here to tell you it goes to the field office in Dallas, Texas, and is never to be seen again, pretty much. They don't get enforced very, very frequently unless there is really good documentary evidence to it and whatnot. And frankly, just sending a newspaper article rarely is enough for the IRS. So I would say act in good faith, do the things that you need to do. I wouldn't worry if a newspaper publishes something that gets it wrong or does something wrong. If it's truly egregious and truly misrepresents your point of view in the organization, maybe asking for a retraction or something like that might be in order. But for the most part, I wouldn't worry about that.
Great, thank you so much for that. So we're going to get to a bunch of questions around Twitter handles, personal versus professional, etc. But there's a couple more sort of organizational activity questions I want to cover. Do you have recommendations on keeping track of your lobbying time?
Yes. The number one thing that you would want to do as an organization is have a good, easy to use timesheet for anybody that's involved in any advocacy work that might be considered lobbying activity. We've got an entire record keeping publication over at boulderadvocacy.org, and it includes some sample timesheets that might be helpful for you. We also, from time to time, can help answer questions on all of that. A lot is going to depend on where you're doing your advocacy work. If all you do is federal stuff, it's super easy. You basically just want to make sure you've got grassroots and direct lobbying included in there, and that's it. You start getting involved at some of the state level, you might have to have certain columns for, I don't know, are you working in California and doing regulatory work in California? Well, you're going to have to track your time separately there. It won't count as lobbying for IRS purposes, but you will have to report to the state of California. Like I said, there's a bunch of other states that have that as well. So your timesheet's going to have to be as sophisticated as your advocacy work is. But it's really the number one tool, because then you're capturing data that is related to the time and identity of the folks that are doing that work. You marry that stuff together and you can convert time into dollars. And once you have dollars, that's easy to aggregate and put on your 990.
And so just a quick follow-up on that. If you're taking a federal meeting with a meeting with the legislator on the Hill, the time you're counting is from when you leave the office to when you get back, basically?
That, and then also any prep time for it, any research time that you do for it, any meetings that maybe you have with other folks on staff talking about your strategy for that. All of those things should be added up. If the primary purpose of those meetings and that prep work is for that lobbying contact. Yeah.
And then relatedly, certainly the time you might spend writing an email or on a call would count, but is there a cost to that call or that email?
Yeah, the way you capture overhead stuff like that, like the cost of your internet access and your phones and things like that, is that what you will do is, remember how I said you aggregate all of the data that comes in. What you do also is you figure out, okay, how much of all the hours worked across the entire organization, how many of those hours were direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying, and that you apply that very often very small percentage, because there's a ton of hours being worked that aren't anywhere near lobbying activity. That very small percentage you apply to overhead things like rent and telephones and internet access and things like that.
Perfect.
And that's
Thank
how you
you.
capture it.
That's super helpful. And I have to say, capturing all of that is one of the challenges, I think, for us.
You are not alone. That is probably the hardest thing to do. organizationally for that. And one thing I'll say as a caveat to all of that is the IRS doesn't have any specific accounting principles that you need to follow. You just need to be able to show your math, and your system needs to be reasonable, and that's it. So as long as you can, if audited, which hopefully you won't be, the IRS says, okay, you reported this much lobbying in fiscal year 2018. Show us how you got there. And if you can show that, then you're going to be okay. One thing I'll say is kind of a I'll call it a story from folks that I have worked with before. When they have been audited, if you have a good record keeping system, you are already in the 95th percentile of success for most of these IRS agents, because when they do go out, they tend to not see good record keeping systems. And so I'm not going to say that they're going to ignore things, but they will have a much more cursory level of review. If they see that you're acting in good faith and you've got a good record keeping system, then they may not drill super deep into some forensic detail of your accounting. If you don't have a very good set of record keeping documents, then there is something that's a lot more egregious, then they might do a much more thorough audit. So good record keeping system and good faith should make things a lot easier for you.
That is really good to hear. So I'm going to try to summarize a bunch of these questions around Twitter use.
Sure.
I think at its heart, people are obviously trying to stay on the right side of the line, obviously, and people sometimes will use their personal accounts, and then and they've been told to include caveats. And so one of the questions is, does saying like, all tweets are my own caveat, does that have any effect in the eyes of the law?
Yeah.
We sometimes say New America doesn't take positions as an organization, but our individuals and programs do, as an explanation for some of the more partisan things. But does that distinction actually matter? You know, tweets don't represent my employer, like political activity disclaimers in bios, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that all helps. I mean, again, this is facts and circumstances, right? And it's a subjective analysis, and we look at everything. So if you're trying to show that the individual accounts for these folks are truly individual and that they are showing just individual opinions on these subject matter areas, that's fine. Where you might run into some problems potentially is this person tweeting only during work hours while they're being employed by the organization, and they ignore it completely otherwise? You know, it'd be hard to say, oh, this is a personal account, or just showing personal views. But that also suggests that the IRS is really digging in that deep on things. Should come as no surprise, the IRS has given us incredibly limited guidance on internet, period, much less social media. So we really don't have a ton to go on all of this. So I would say, again, going back to kind of first principles, acting in good faith, trying to show the separation where it's relevant and where it's needed. I think that you really can't go wrong with those types of things, especially if you're trying to accomplish a scenario where you're saying, look, we've got individuals out here who have more nuanced positions that act outside of C3 realms, and those positions are independent of the organization. If you're able to document that, show that through, I don't know, bios, links, things like that, that's super helpful. I don't think that under most circumstances, the IRS is going to dig in too terribly deeply, nor would they use that as the basis of some kind of audit or complaint against the organization. It would really require a lot more than that, which isn't to say that they couldn't, but it's just based on their track record, it would be really weird for them to go, oh, well, the one Twitter account for this one guy working for New America, oof, that's super problematic. We're going to audit them now. It's real unlikely that would happen.
That is excellent to hear. I think relatedly, sorry, here, where am I? If somebody is using their personal account, which has their New America affiliation in the profile, and tweeting about candidates they support, what rules govern?
It would be best if they didn't include any reference to their New America role in anything that does stuff like that. It gets a little trickier in social media. especially Facebook. Facebook's a really tough area, but I think that what we've come down on with Facebook, for instance, Facebook is sort of this is you as a total person. It's you at work and it's you outside of work. And it's all kind of mashed together. And there's been no indication that the IRS is saying, well, it says that they work for New America, but at the same time, it says that they support, Joe Schmo in Ward 2. The IRS doesn't seem to really be enforcing laws to that granular level of detail. But I will say, the more separation that you can show between your individual work and your C3 side, the better. So if there is a way to separate out when you're doing things that show support or opposition to candidates, making sure that that's in platforms and in ways that just don't show that relationship, that's better. There are some platforms, Facebook's a great example of one, where it's hard. You can't divorce yourself in that kind of a way. It's really going to be contextually driven. But to the greatest extent that you can is probably for the best. That would be kind of where I'd leave that. And again, it's all contextually driven. So it's really going to depend on the scenario, the candidate, the person, etc.
And I assume that the same would apply here for an account that you use for if I on my personal handle tweet about broadband access, because that's an issue I care about, as well as cat memes, and then I'm also perhaps tweeting using an organizational handle. That it sounds like that falls also in the same gray area.
Yeah, I mean, I'll use an example. I'll go back to this slide. Down here, you'll notice that in the Twitter thing, I've got my official work one, AFJ Tim, right? That's the one where I use when I talk about election law, election administration, nonprofit advocacy, things like that, C3 stuff. I also have another Twitter account, which I like to call my jokes and garbage account, where if you want to hear about Buffalo Bills football, Syracuse University basketball, and all of my politics, it's all in there, right? So that's how I show that separation. It's just easier for me to have that one real bright line. That's not going to be true for everyone, though. I mean, some people are going to have their personal account. They're going to pull in their work stuff a little bit more into that. They're going to their work is going to highlight that account. And maybe that account from time to time puts on different hats. That's all totally fine. Heck, the president doesn't. I mean, that's his own personal account, but he's violating the Hatch Act all the time and doing all sorts of things. I mean, talk about a multi-tiered account that uses different hats at different times. I'm not saying everybody should emulate the president's Twitter behavior by any stretch of the imagination. However, I think that there is a difference with how social media is looked upon. And I think so long as you are doing it in a reasonable, again, good faith way to show the distinction between your personal time or your personal work and your work-related work, I think that there are ways to do that in Twitter and elsewhere.
And I think we have now officially gone 24 minutes over, and we basically hit all the points. So I want to thank everybody for sticking around. We still have most of our participants here, so I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Tim, for taking the time to take us through this. Should we have future questions, how should we reach out?
The best way for anybody to reach us is right here on this slide that you're seeing right now. You can call us toll free at 866-NP-LOBBY. I think we paid extra for that, nonprofit lobby. Or you can email us. Email is probably the best bet these days. Every day there's somebody that can answer your questions. I think tomorrow is my day. So if you do have questions and you email that address tomorrow, you will get me. But we've got Monday through Friday an attorney at one of our offices that answers these questions. So anything having to do with advocacy and your organization, we're super happy to help out. Of course, there's also resources available at our website as well. Really look forward to hearing more from you. And thank you for the opportunity to talk today.
And we will be sharing the slide deck as well, and there'll be an opportunity to hear the recording if you missed any portions of this later as well. Thank you again, Tim.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.